Hey there! In this video, I'll be taking a look at the low light or high ISO performance of the FX30 and comparing it with the R7. Now, I'm really excited about the FX30. I got it just earlier this week, and hopefully you got a chance to check out my first impressions video. There's a lot of great footage in there, so go check that out if you want to see what this camera really looks like out in the real world. Now, in this video, I'll be comparing the FX30 with the R7, but I have to say there's some super interesting results about the FX30 in particular, which we'll get onto at the second half of the video. So for these tests here, I basically recorded in the highest possible mode that I could internally in the camera. So the FX30 was recorded in 4K XAVC SI 10-bit 422, and the R7 was recorded in 4K Fine IPB, which is also in 10-bit 422. So for all these tests, if you haven't seen these before, basically I maintain a constant frame rate of 24 frames a second, the shutter is 1/50, and I hold a constant aperture. And then what I do is I expose S-Log3 in the FX30 without a LUT in the camera to 41% on a gray card. And for C-Log3 in the R7, I do it to 35% on the gray card. And that's proper exposure for S-Log3 and C-Log3. And then after everything is exposed properly, I will raise the ISO through the range. For each stop raising the ISO, I'll just lower the key light to get the proper exposure in the camera. I then bring it into the computer and I grade everything at the base ISO, so I don't make any adjustments to the higher ISO, so you can definitely see color shifts and noise and all that sort of stuff. Now, usually I only show the higher values of the ISO range, but there's so much going on here that I'm just gonna put the whole range from 800 to 25,600 in this video so that I can document it. Now, if you don't wanna watch it, that's fine. There are chapter markers down below you can skip around. But if you're trying to figure out what's going on between these two cameras, make sure you're paying attention to the noise and the color. So check it out. First, let's talk about how these two cameras compare against each other, and then we'll get into the FX30 in particular. So I'd say they're pretty similar in terms of their noise levels, and they're both good up to about 6,400 or 8,000 or so. Now, up until around ISO 3200, I would say the FX30 is just slightly cleaner, but just slightly. From 4,000 to 10,000, I think they're about the same. And then 12,800 and 16,000, I'd say the R7 is definitely cleaner than the FX30. And above 16,000, so 20,000 and 25,600, they're both pretty bad. Now that I went over how these two cameras compare against each other in the high ISO range, let's talk about some of the things I realized about the FX30 during these tests. The first thing is the color shift. It definitely shifts towards green and yellow as you progress through the ISO range. And I didn't notice this in the R7, so it's something that is in the FX30. It's not something to do with my key light because I use the same light in the same environment for both tests. It definitely gets, as I said, progressively worse through the ISO range, but there's definitely a big shift that I notice happens going from 3200 to 4000. You can see that in these clips here. And you can also see it on the vector scope with the skin tones shifting towards green and yellow away from the skin tone line. Besides the color shift, there's something else I discovered while testing out this camera, and that has to do with the dual base ISO that this camera has. So before we get into the FX30 in particular, what is a dual base ISO? That's when a camera has two sensitivity levels that have the same level of noise and dynamic range. Now, I didn't test dynamic range for this video, but I definitely tested the noise level at different ISOs. So in cameras that have dual base ISOs or dual sensitivity ISOs, most of us have heard about the Sony FX30 or A7S III going from 10,000 to 12,800 because it has a second base ISO at 12,800. And you know that it definitely cleans up going from 10,000 to 12,800. Now this camera has a dual base ISO of 800 and 2,500. So as you step up through the ISO range, when you go from 2,000 to 2,500, it should clean up. It should hit that second base ISO and look cleaner. So if you take a look at these examples here, you can see that going from 2000 to 2500, it gets noisier. It doesn't get cleaner. And when you compare them against each other, you can also see that the 2500 ISO is definitely not cleaner than the 2000. All right, so this camera, in my opinion, doesn't have a dual base ISO at 2500 or a second base ISO at 2500. Now, the other thing we can compare here, if it does have a dual base ISO of 800 and 2500, it should, again, have the same level of noise and dynamic range at 800 and 2500. So I've been testing this all in the flexible ISO mode because then I can change the ISO. So here you go, checking out the noise levels between 800 and 2500, and even comparing them against each other, you can see that the ISO 2500 definitely has more noise than ISO 800. Now, I tested this both in flexible ISO, and I also tested this in Cine EI because in Cine EI, you only have the option of two base ISOs of 800 and 2500, and I got similar results. Okay, so what's going on here? I have no idea, but from what I can see in my testing, it doesn't look like it has a second base ISO of 2500, and that green-yellow color shift as you progress through the ISO range is not very desirable. So I'm still wondering about the sensor in this camera. I stated in an earlier video that maybe it was an older sensor that was getting reused from somewhere else because Sony makes a lot of sensors out there. I'm not really sure. If you know about that in particular and have proof, please let me know down below if this is actually a new sensor. I'd be really curious. Anyways, a lot more videos coming up about the FX30. I'll be testing it in a lot of ways, comparing it against the R7 and also against the FX3. I'm really excited about it. Even with these results, when I went out and shot in the real world, it looked beautiful, and I really enjoyed the footage and the colors and all that stuff. So go check out this video here, which is the first impressions video that I was just talking about. So you can definitely see what this camera looks like. Otherwise, thanks for watching, hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.